What up, y'all? It's your boy Coffee Kid, back with another episode of The Observation. It's episode 7. Let's see what we got here. We got a video by the Caspian Report, a YouTube channel. They cover kind of like socio-cultural, economic type of topics and discussions, and almost like geopolitical type discussions and turbulence between various countries, or brief cultural political history of interacting countries and regions of the world. And in this video, title you can see top left, France secretly owns 14 countries. So I guess backstory for those who don't know, I believe it's only 2 countries in the world that were never colonized. So only 2 countries that were never under imperial rule, meaning another country came, ruled over them, controlled their economics, embedded their culture and ways of living into a different culture by force. And in this context is France, so Central and Western Africa, around not too far from the Gold Coast, Ivory Coast, and Guinea and Mali. So yeah, I believe France left around the 40s, somewhere post World War II, roughly. But I mean, they had political interest there after World War II, and even now today, from a resource standpoint and a raw material standpoint and economic gross production. So yeah, I'm interested to learn what this guy's take on the topic is. It's interesting how I start to see, maybe it's always been existing, but now with social media, and for some reason this year and back half of 2022, I've seen a lot of more vocalization from African diasporas when it comes to interference within African countries by European states. And this video was posted a couple weeks ago, if I remember right, just from looking at it briefly. So yeah, it's just following more of the trend of more of this, like, and this guy's probably, I don't know what race he is, but he's not African. So it's just kind of like this global, I'm starting to see this global, like, mental shift / lens perception shift into what's going on in Africa. And why do we not see, tangible movement when it comes to the GDP of Africa? Why is there no tangible growth? Even though, the U.S., for example, is first world country, but the most established country in the world, arguably. They've only, 1776 was when, so not even 300 years that the best country in the world has been in existence, and most of Africa didn't fully gain their independence till roughly like 60, 70 years ago. So that's very new. So maybe that's part of the answer, but I think from what I can tell, this guy's gonna have a take, a more economic / social take on why Africa is the way it is. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it, man.
This is a banknote from Senegal. Here is another from Congo. They look nothing like each other, yet they are part of the same scheme, a scheme that pegs both currencies to the euro, a rate determined by the French treasury. The issue at stake is the apex of French policymaking, the CFA franc. Using it, France controls the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, making up nearly 200 million people. These countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and the Central African Republic. And while these nations have a seat at the United Nations and wave their independent flags, it is only the face of imperialism that has changed. The conduct of business has largely remained the same. The big difference is that imperialism used to be spread through tanks. Nowadays, it comes through banks. Special thanks to the sponsor of this video, and much more. Anyone can create money. The hard part is having others accept it. In pre-colonial times, many African societies used cowrie seashells as a medium of exchange. These seashells were so widely circulated that by 1800 they had an official exchange rate with the French currency. But as the French Empire colonized deeper into Africa, Paris sought to monopolize these circuits of production and trade. Taxes were demanded in francs, and armed troops were sent to markets, forcing merchants to accept French currency. From the 1930s onwards, France came to dominate the money supply in French-speaking Africa. With new power came new extrajudicial perks. Paris gained access to African labor and raw materials at sub-market prices, while finished goods were sold back to Africa at above-market prices. French neo-colonialism was so intrusive, so ruthless, so unique that it earned a name of its own, France-Afrique. Following World War II, however, things changed. Paris joined the Bretton Woods system, and as a result, the French franc was devalued to set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. These fiscal reforms were taking place at a time when Africa was decolonizing itself. A weaker currency only added fuel to the fire. So, to hold on to its African holdings, France conjured a new currency in 1945 called the CFA franc and forced its colonies to adopt it. Initially, the CFA franc was pegged to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1, but in 1948 it was increased to 2 to 1. By overvaluing the CFA franc, Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing Africa's export competitiveness. So in a way, France built its post-war recovery partially to a wealth transfer from Africa. Even so, the most effective forms of control are those that are invisible. Recognizing this in 1958, France hijacked authentic decolonization by installing local collaborators and granting them statehood. These collaborators became the custodians of France's neo-colonial empire by maintaining the franc zone and French military bases. Only Guinea turned down the offer. Its leader, Sékou Touré, declared that his people preferred being poor in freedom than rich in slavery. Guinea thus rejected the CFA franc, seeking to develop its own currency. France felt it needed to make an example of Guinea, so it cut pensions to war veterans, dismantled Guinea's power grid, and then attempted to block its UN membership. France went as far as to induce hyperinflation by flooding the country with counterfeit bills, all the while funding armed anti-government resistance. Yeah, it got pretty crazy. The plan ultimately failed to dislodge Sékou Touré, but Guinea's economy never fully recovered. Likewise, when Togo had a change of heart and sought to ditch the CFA franc, France made another example, this time without loose ends. Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement is suspected, but official records remain conveniently closed. Of itself, further attempts to conceal French imperialism followed. The CFA franc was split into two currencies covering the Central and West African states. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and moved to Yaoundé and Dakar. Though local Africans staffed these institutions, there were no fundamental policy changes, and France retained veto power over the banks' governing statutes. This included a requirement that member states deposit half their exchange reserves at the French treasury plus another 20% for financial liabilities, meaning member states retained access only to 30% of their money. Moreover, all foreign exchange conversions were to pass through the French treasury. The way this fiscal policy works is by operations accounts. These are special accounts held at the French treasury. The denominations are in euros, but when accounts are in credit, the African central banks effectively place their foreign exchange reserves at France's disposal. But when the central banks' accounts are in debit, they are obligated to pay interest to the French treasury. In other words, CFA member states pay France to hold on to their money. Even more unsettling, no one knows what France does with the money. The French treasury does not disclose this information even to CFA franc nations. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if France were to reinvest African funding for French profit. However, one looks at it, the CFA scheme is an effective moneymaker for France, and French businesses benefit as much as the French treasury. More specifically, France doesn't need to draw on its foreign exchange reserves for African imports. Dozens of French multinationals are present in Africa, including TotalEnergies, Areva, and Vinci. Africa also grants France access to strategic resources like uranium, which is indispensable for France's nuclear energy sector, meeting 3/4 of French energy needs. Meanwhile, Gabon is a source of crude oil, Mauritania delivers iron ore, while Togo and Benin provide agricultural commodities. Additionally, the icing on the cake, French national Vincent Bolloré owns most of West Africa's major ports. It is thus not by incident that former French President Jacques Chirac once stated that much of the money in French banks comes precisely from exploiting Africa, and that France would lose its global standing without its African empire. To preserve its hegemony, France has intervened militarily on the continent 40 times since the 1960s, from propping up corrupt dictators to conducting military operations in the Sahel. Moreover, the configurations of the CFA franc allow profits and capital to be repatriated with ease. Between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion to capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually had it been reinvested domestically. Meanwhile, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the main oil producers, transferred out the money equivalent of 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Similar trends are present in Gabon and Cameroon. Opulence at the top generates misery below. Though advocates point to the CFA franc's stability, a lack of monetary sovereignty restricts the tools available to the CFA member states. For instance, Ivory Coast's inflation rate is below 6% versus 29% in neighboring Ghana, but the latter's extreme poverty rate is only 13% versus 30% of Ivorians. The CFA member states also lag behind other African states growth-wise. Some are even going backwards. Ivory Coast's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Meanwhile, Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not topped their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. This means these countries have had little to no real economic growth in decades. But change is the only constant in life. In recent years, the societies of the CFA member states have started publicly talking about alternatives. It's a trend that is becoming increasingly louder. The most feasible proposal is to form a regional currency bloc untethered from French control. Some proponents of this plan would use the West African ECOWAS economic union as a springboard. This would reorient the CFA franc member states around Nigeria, which accounts for more than 2/3 of the regional GDP. Plus, Nigeria is a net oil exporter, while most West African states are importers, so there is a natural synergy in the ECOWAS region. Of course, nothing worth having comes easy. Paris has sought to forestall these attempts. A law to this effect was passed in the French Senate in January 2021. It looks to change the West African CFA franc into the ECO, and then abolish the operations accounts and withdraw French personnel from the central banks. All this is to be completed by 2027, but Paris would still retain effective control. Where the African monetary reserves would be held, at which location remains unaddressed. It's safe to say that the French reform is nothing but a ruse. Ultimately, the best solution may be for the individual states to have their own central banks and currencies, fixed to a common regional unit at an adjustable rate. This would give monetary sovereignty to 14 nations, or nearly 200 million people. But many still fear crossing swords with France, and for good reasons. So, any attempts to break away from French hegemony would require a joint effort across the CFA franc zone. Most of all, the African collaborating elites who benefit from the system would need to be sidelined and replaced by lawmakers prepared to embark on a path of self-directed development. This may prove to be the greatest stumbling block, and it's something that has to change from within, because there is nothing more agreeable in life than making peace with the status quo, and yet nothing more corrupting. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Remember to play War Thunder now on PC, PlayStation or Xbox using the link on the screen. Upon registration, you will get a large
Wow. A lot to unpack. First off, I'm going to just say I'm not sure. I mean, he lists a lot of his sources, but at the end of the day, this is a secondary source, and he does give a lot of opinions. So take that for what it is. But regardless, he does pose some very deep questions and thought-provoking analysis and kind of conjecture as an answer to those questions. But I've said this in previous videos, man. You judge a fruit by the tree, and you judge a tree by its fruits. So if we're looking at the GDP and we're looking at French monetary policy and French history of monetary control over these countries, and then we're looking at the GDP growth being stagnant and sometimes slightly negative over decades, that's not normal when these are resource rich countries, at least most of them. So if the fruit is rotten, that means the tree's probably rotten. So some of the questions that he's posing as to the French intention and the system of French monetary control over these Western African countries, if the fruits are rotten, well, that's the tree, man. Like that tree's rotten. That system is rotten. And I've referenced, some doctorates and philosophers that work within the IMF and consult with the IMF, speak with the International Monetary Fund, have spoken on the theory of status quo. Like elites. Corruption is always driven by some sort of resistance to change the status quo. Whether it's a thing of fear from the elites, whether it's greed, whatever it may be, the resistance to change it overbears the desire to pour into a population or increase the standard of living, right? Like he says, Ivory Coast they have no control over their inflation, over their employment, largely because they have no sovereign monetary policy. They have no sovereign bank. Like if the whatever African banks exist are essentially just sub banks of France. They don't have the same margins and the same profit as those French banks, because historically there's a gap in time. Like the colonization, the grasp of colonization is very recently left. So yeah, it's weird how you start to look around, you hear the narrative of we don't want European interference. You know, the African Union a couple weeks ago kicked out Israel from in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. They kicked them out from the African Union conference. And there's a lot of politics, obviously, as to why that happened. But you start to just see like just different instances of a resistance and a Pan-African mindset away from European interference. But I think it's hard because he references it at the end of this video. The elites, the African elites that are now over these independent states, right? They make money. They have sustenance. They don't want the status quo to leave, right? So if the only solution is to unite, the only solution is to become together as one rock, you can't do that when you have quasi-controlled states with elite Africans that, you know, control the government and run elections and have positions of power, maybe own some of the relatively bigger businesses comparatively. Obviously, it's not on the scale of France because it's like, you know, they're under France. France is here, and then the Africans are here at the end of the day. But even here is a nice living. It's a nice, it's the status quo that they don't want to change for the benefit of the people. But yeah, man, 200 million people in these West African countries, that's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. So comes back to resistance to change. Maybe the motive's greed. Maybe it's fear of what the marginalized population will do once they become it's that fear of history, just like you see in the U.S., the fear of critical race theory, the fear of a truly, raw taught history of how the world unfolded and the atrocities of colonization, regardless of how far it propelled us industrially, because we don't allow the shift in our mind to say, okay, what if the roles were reversed and somehow it was Africa that was on a conquest? Spike Lee he tried to put out a movie years ago where it was white people that were enslaved and black people were slave owners. I can't recall exactly what happened, but I mean, they shot that shit down quickly, man. Quickly. So when you talk about frame of reference and worldview, it's a very powerful thing because it inspires movements and inspires. There's 200 million people there. There's a lot of smart people out of 200 million that if they had a worldview that was, flipping the script of how we view how the world came to be currently, and they have the intelligence and they know they know economic principles and they know, the pillars that are needed to propagate a country and to propagate a civilization of people in a way that is, has a good standard of living. When you have African bodies who have that motivation and that different worldview, the Afrocentric worldview, it's a dangerous thing. So you can see why they're resisting to it, but now it makes sense why this Pan-African, even the African Unions, like, you just starting to see it on the internet. You start to see it in media's covering it. I'm just seeing more stuff pop out of that's just like European interference. Not anti-European. It's not like we hate white people. It's not like the Africans want to kill white people. That's the problem. Like, people, when Africa wants to take control, they're viewed as a threat. Even though if Guinea tried to go into France and tell them what to do with their monetary policy, we would be like, who? They would be like, who are these guys? Who do they think they are? But when France has been doing that for X amount of years, and now Guinea and all these Western African countries are saying we don't want to do it anymore, they feel disrespected. They feel threatened. So, I mean, that's just kind of like a bird's eye view as to how I see it. Just my opinion. But then again, like, it's the fruits, man. The fruits are not as ripe as they could be. What does that say about the tree? What even is the tree? Let's define what is the tree. You know? Right now, to me, it's France and the French banks and the French influence. Right? So, maybe we need to take a look at that tree and the roots of it. The system. But I'm not an economic policy expert. I'm a finance graduate, but not an econ graduate. So who am I to really say, like, this is, all conjecture. I've seen Thomas Sowell, who's kind of, he's a black philosopher who says that colonialism didn't do anything. I've seen Jordan Peterson and Maggot Wade, a Senegalese entrepreneur she is, talk about how colonization didn't affect where Africa is today. It has no impact on where Africa is today. I mean, to me, that's just parts of what they're trying to argue I can maybe agree with, but you can't say that colonization doesn't have that impact. You can't, because France's banking industry profits off of any money generated in these Western African countries. You know what I'm saying? Like, these Western African countries don't own their banking industries. Is that too much to ask? How can you say that doesn't have some sort of relation to colonization? Why the banking industries aren't propagating in Western Africa, in these respective nation states? How can you say that colonization didn't have an impact? Right? Now, you got 200 million people. There's a lot of good universities, I'm sure. A lot of smart doctors, finance graduates, economists, political thinkers, that come out of Africa, this Western Africa. But what power do they have with this knowledge? It takes years and it takes unity to flip the script. And yes, they can go out and be successful. They can go out and get a job in the U.S. or get a job in their country or Europe and, generate wealth for their family because of the knowledge that they have and their ability to provide value for private government industry, whatever it may be. But when it comes to population matters and when it comes to improving a population, you need those people to remain in the country and have some sort of influence on policy. Well, when you try to have an influence on policy, you hit that ceiling. The man pulling the strings is gonna say no. You can only do so much, right? And in this case, it's France. But Italy, Spain, all those other countries did the same thing in West Africa as the French are doing in other parts of Africa. You know what I'm saying? So when I hear Maggot Wade and Jordan Peterson saying that, I agree. Like, the individual, you can empower yourself through education and through skills and through people skills and through learning how to talk. But you can have your personal success. Does that impact the policy of a country and the macroeconomics of the country, of population health, employment? Does it? Education, does it? No. No. So it's like the residuals of colonization very much prevalent. So when I hear, Thomas Sowell and these, to me, you can't say colonization didn't affect. What type of worldview is that, man? It's not they tried to frame it as Africans are making excuses for themselves. It's not true, because there's so many brilliant Africans who are doctors, lawyers, etc., etc., and you still don't see shit changed. So it's a whole lot of just falsehoods, man. Like, falsehoods. Comes down to status quo, greed. It's the root of it, But I don't know, man. It's a deep topic to unpack, and I would probably say, like, that's probably, like, really the passion that I have, just to learn more, learn every day about this type of stuff, so I can have a more valid opinion to contribute. Because, realistically, like, my breakdown of this is strictly just opinion. Like, it doesn't impact anybody. It doesn't help anybody. It might help someone to be inspired to learn more themselves. So from that perspective, that's why I'm just like, I gotta say something, or at least put out my opinion in a digital form. But I don't know, man. Reminds me of just a lot of these, like, macro political topics and like macro human behavior trends that we see that are the overlying themes as to why this situation right here that this video unpacks. A lot of those themes, to me, like, they really overarch with a lot of what's said in scripture, or at least scripture, looking through the lens of scripture, can provide some sort of solace or understanding around, like, why this is happening. Not why it's happening, but, like, it predict. It's almost like it's not a surprise as to why it's happening. It's like a prescribed part of our humanity and our denial of a higher power. So I'm gonna leave y'all with this verse from Acts chapter 19, verses 24 through 29 and verse 32. Just some context, right? Paul and some of the disciples are actually fled Jerusalem right here, if you see my cursor. They were spreading the gospel up through those regions of Turkey and Greece for a number of years, and causing commotions, stirring up political uprisings and philosophical uprisings amongst the people of Turkey, like Central Asia and Greece. Now, they did bring the gospel to Athens and a lot of this region, right? But with that being the context, I think this section of these verses that I'm about to read in Acts are when they're in a Greek province or state, or extension of the Greek state. But yeah, so the verse reads, "A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, 'My friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul,'" Paul is the one who's traveling and spreading the gospel, has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus, and in practicality the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions, from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into a theater together. The assembly of people was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. Think about that. Demetrius, the silversmith, who makes this money that is circulating and being traded amongst other various industries and businesses, viewed Paul's philosophy of the gospel, viewed the gospel and the truth of Jesus Christ and the Most High, viewed it as a threat to the industries and the worldviews that they had propagated on their people. Money. Artemis was the face of on these silver coins. What does that remind you of, man? Does that not have undertones in this whole situation that's going on in West Africa and other parts of the world? You know? What's modern day Greece? Who's modern day Demetrius? Who's spreading these falsehoods about Paul and gathering people in confusion about what's really going on? What do we believe Paul, what he's saying about the world and Jesus? Or do we believe the system that we are currently living in which we profit, or at least some people profit off of? What do we believe? So that same kind of struggle with the world and with the Most High is prevalent. That's in Acts. Jesus and the way was a threat to other industries, idols, and forms of captivation, forms of entertainment, whatever it may be. The money made from those endeavors was at risk by the truth and the way. So those who had profit to lose were driven by greed to cast doubt on the way of the Lord and instigate division in the people. That was kind of my reflection of it. I wrote it down separately. The assembly was in confusion. The people that Demetrius and his colleagues gathered in to, cast doubt on Paul and his two colleagues that they had detained. There's confusion. What do we believe? Some were shouting one thing, some were shouting other. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. All we know is there's division, there's turmoil. Like when you go to one of these African city-states, and you have the elites, the status quo, and you have the French, and then you have the people, right? And the people, a lot of them don't know why they're there. Like I said, there's a lot of smart people, a lot of doctors, lawyers, etc. But a lot of the population is still suffering. The GDP didn't grow over decades. So what happens when you introduce this new worldview, even though this is separate from the gospel, this new worldview of what colonialism and monetary control over these countries has, how it's impacted their industry and their ability to, increase their standard of living. When you introduce that worldview, it's commotion. Dudes don't know what to believe because they're just stuck in the daily struggles of life. So it's a comparable. It's not the same, but it's comparable. And if that happens in the Bible with the Most High and the truth of the way, then obviously when it comes to this and it comes to socioeconomic struggles, obviously that's going to happen, right? If it can happen with the truth of the way, it can happen with this. So, I don't know. It's just the beauty of the Bible, man. When you reflect on the undertones of what Paul and the disciples went through, you know, some of those undertones can be seen in other parts of life beyond when they died. But it is what it is, man. It's been another episode of The Observation, episode 7, by your boy Kaffa Kid. We talk about what it was and what it is. Appreciate if you tuned in this long and listened to me talk y'all's ear off. I truly do appreciate. If you enjoyed, you liked, disliked, disagreed, agreed, just throw something in the comments, man. If you're an economic expert or political policy expert, throw something in the comments, man. I'd love to hear your take on this video and whether or not this guy's stretching the truth or stretching facts. I mean, he cites sources, so I think it's a valid hypothesis what he's bringing to the, like I said, the fruits and the trees. You judge the tree by the fruit. So I agree personally with what he's saying, but would love to hear other opinions. But other than that, man, like, comment, subscribe if you're new. Would much appreciate it, man. I'm just here to state my case, state my passion. But y'all stay blessed, and I'm out.